There are men who dream quietly, and there are men whose dreams are so loud, the world itself must bend to listen. Napoleon Bonaparte was one of them. A boy born on a forgotten island who once believed he could shape destiny with his own hands. He dreamed not just of victory, but of empire, of order, glory, and immortality. But dreams like his always come with a price. When we speak his name, we often see the image of a man in a gray coat standing against the wind, watching a horizon that would never belong to him again. Yet, before the fall, there was the rise. Before the exile, there was the fire. Before the legend, there was a child, staring out at the sea, wondering if the world would ever know his name. This is not just the story of wars and crowns. It's the story of ambition, of how far a soul can climb when it refuses to be ordinary. It's the story of brilliance and blindness, of love and loneliness, of a man who touched the sky only to fall back into the dust from which he came. In the quiet hours of history, Napoleon remains, not as a conqueror or tyrant, but as a question. What happens when a dream becomes greater than the dreamer? Tonight, let us walk with him from the warm shores of Corsica to the frozen fields of Russia and to the final whisper of waves on a lonely island. And if stories like this move something within you, join us, subscribe, stay close as we journey through the rise and fall of Napoleon, the man who dreamed the world into an empire. Chapter 1. The Boy from Corsica. The island of Corsica, a land of salt and sunlight, where the sea hums softly against the cliffs, and the air smells of pine and rebellion. In this rough cradle, a child was born on August 15th, 1769. Napoleone di Bonaparte. His family was noble by name, but poor by circumstance. The Bonapartes lived in a modest house in Ajaccio, where the ocean light fell through cracked shutters, and the sound of waves mixed with the voices of a dozen children. His father, Carlo, was a dreamer, a lawyer caught between debts and ideals. His mother, Letizia, was steel beneath gentleness. She ruled her home with quiet strength, raising her sons with discipline and faith. Later, Napoleon would say he owed everything to her. Corsica itself was at war with its identity. Once free, now under French control, its people lived between pride and surrender. Young Napoleone breathed that tension every day. He was Corsican by blood, French by law, and restless by nature. He would often stand at the shore, watching the ships disappear toward the horizon, feeling something stir in him. A need to prove, to become, to rise. He was small for his age, serious beyond his years. Other boys played. He observed. He studied their laughter, their cruelty, their small victories, and quietly stored every lesson. Words could wound, he learned. Silence could command. Books became his refuge. He devoured stories of Alexander the Great, Caesar, Hannibal. Men who turned the world with their will. To him, they were not distant heroes. They were mirrors of what could be. He began to see history as a stage, and himself as someone who might one day stand upon it. At 9, he left Corsica for France, alone, trembling and determined. He entered the military school at Brienne, where his accent made him a target. The French boys mocked his rough Corsican tongue, his simple clothes, his pride in a land they called savage. But humiliation became fuel. He studied harder, marched longer, thought deeper. Each insult hardened him, shaped him, sharpened him. He found solace in solitude. He learned to think while walking, to dream while staring into nothing. He wrote letters to his family, filled with longing, but also with purpose. "I will make them see," he once promised. And in that promise, a destiny began to take root. By the time he turned 15, the boy who had arrived in France as an outsider had become its most gifted cadet. Brilliant in mathematics, fierce in discipline, already obsessed with strategy and control. He still missed the sea, though. The waves of Corsica haunted his dreams, the rhythm of a simpler life that no longer belonged to him. Somewhere deep inside, that boy from the island remained, silent, watching, waiting for the day when the world would finally hear his name. Napoleon Bonaparte. The boy from Corsica was ready to begin his march toward history. Chapter 2. The Making of a Soldier. At 15, Napoleon arrived at the Royal Military School in Paris, thin, pale, and burning with quiet ambition. The city felt enormous, cold and foreign, yet he carried within him the stubborn pride of Corsica and the memory of his mother's steady eyes. He did not come to belong. He came to conquer. Life in the academy was harsh. The sons of nobles laughed at his accent, his frayed coat, the way he walked as if already burdened by destiny. But ridicule never broke him. It hardened him, turned his silence into armor. When others slept, he studied. When others feasted, he wrote. He became obsessed with discipline, order, and control. The very things that would one day define his empire. Mathematics, history, strategy. These were his weapons. He studied Caesar's campaigns, Frederick the Great's maneuvers, the geometry of war. He saw battle not as chaos, but as a living puzzle, a field of logic and courage intertwined. A soldier, he once wrote, must think before he fights. Even then, his mind was more that of a commander than a cadet. He graduated at 16, younger than most, and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery. The cannons fascinated him. They were precise, unforgiving, and obedient, just as he wished the world to be. The young officer spent hours inspecting them, calculating trajectories, memorizing the language of war. He could read the battlefield the way poets read emotion, through rhythm and structure. Yet beneath that discipline, there was a restless dreamer. France in those years was trembling. The revolution was stirring. Whispers of liberty, equality, and blood. Napoleon watched it all with both awe and calculation. He believed in the idea of freedom, but he also saw its danger, how easily passion could devour reason. He began to write essays, reflections on politics and power. In one, he called men instruments of destiny, claiming that only those who dare to command deserve to exist. His words were sharp, his ideas heavy for someone barely 20. But already, he sensed that the world would not be changed by ideals alone. It would be changed by will. Still, he was lonely. The boy from Corsica had become a man of France, but he belonged fully to neither. He dreamed of his island, of the waves that once calmed him. Yet now, another rhythm beat louder. The march of drums, the echo of footsteps, the rising roar of revolution. Sometimes, late at night, he would pace the stone floors of his quarters, whispering to himself. He imagined maps, plans, movements. Invisible battles fought in his mind. He did not yet have an army, but he already had the hunger to lead one. In the quiet of his barracks, he would stare at his sword laid across the table, simple, silver, cold. It was no longer a weapon to him, but a symbol of purpose, of destiny, of the line between dream and power. By the time the first shots of the revolution rang through Paris, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just a young officer. He was a soldier forged by hunger, isolation, and relentless thought, waiting for the moment when chaos would open a door for him. And when it did, he would walk through it without hesitation. Chapter 3. Fire in the Revolution. Paris, 1789. The streets were trembling. The air was thick with the scent of smoke and change. Crowds filled the squares, shouting words that had never been spoken aloud with such fury. Liberty, equality, revolution. The old world was cracking open, and from its dust new men would rise. Among them stood a young officer from Corsica, quiet, watchful, calculating. Napoleon Bonaparte was only 20. To most, he was invisible, just another soldier in a country tearing itself apart. But he saw what others could not: opportunity in the fire, order hidden in chaos. He moved through the streets like a shadow, studying people, listening. He admired their courage, their hunger for justice. Yet he saw madness creeping behind their eyes. The revolution was both birth and storm. It gave men wings, and then burned them. Napoleon knew he had to master that fire, not be consumed by it. In 1793, fate handed him his chance. The port city of Toulon had rebelled, siding with the British. The young officer, now in the artillery, was sent to help retake it. He saw the enemy ships, the hills, the defenses, and in hours he drew a plan no one else could imagine. His mind worked like clockwork, precise and relentless. Under his direction, the French batteries turned the tide. Cannon after cannon roared under his command, tearing through the enemy lines. The victory was swift, shocking and brilliant. Toulon fell, and the name Napoleon Bonaparte was suddenly on the lips of generals and politicians alike.
He was promoted to brigadier general at just 24, from obscurity to recognition, almost overnight. Yet his eyes remained cold, thoughtful. He knew fame was a wind, and wind changes. Paris celebrated him as a hero, but while others drank and toasted the new republic, Napoleon was alone in his quarters, writing in candlelight. He filled pages with thoughts about power, about destiny, about the thin thread between genius and ruin. Circumstances, he wrote, make men. Great men seize them. He was beginning to see himself as one of those men. When the revolution turned darker, when blood ran through the streets and the guillotine became the people's god, Napoleon kept his distance. He despised the chaos, yet he understood its purpose. From the ashes of disorder, a new order must rise, and perhaps, one day, it would rise under him. He became a man of contradictions, loyal yet ambitious, idealistic yet cold. To his soldiers he was precise and demanding, but also strangely magnetic. They obeyed not just out of duty, but belief. He had the rare power to make men see greatness, not in themselves, but in following him. Still, loneliness lingered. He had no family near him, no comfort but his thoughts. He wrote to his brother Joseph, saying, "I live only in the future." And, truly, he did. The revolution had awakened something in him, a hunger not just to serve France, but to command it. By the time the flames of rebellion began to settle, the young general was no longer an observer. He was becoming the fire itself, the spark that would ignite a new age. France had torn down its kings, and somewhere, in the heart of that storm, a new kind of ruler was being born. One not of bloodline, but of sheer will. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, and soon the world would know it. Chapter 4. The Young General. Italy, 1796. The mountains were sharp, the air thick with rain and gunpowder. France was weary from years of revolution and war. Its armies were starving, broken, forgotten. And into that exhaustion rode a young man in a worn grey coat, short, thin, but with eyes that burned like a storm. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte, commander of the army of Italy. When he first addressed his soldiers, they barely listened. Their boots were torn, their stomachs empty. They had fought too long for promises that never came true. But the young general's voice cut through the wind like a blade. "Soldiers," he said, "you are hungry and naked. The government owes you nothing. But I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces and great cities shall be in your power." He did not speak of duty. He spoke of destiny. And for the first time in months, his soldiers believed. Napoleon transformed chaos into movement. He moved fast, thought faster. Where others saw impossible mountains, he saw paths. He struck when no one expected him to. At Montenotte, at Lodi, at Arcole,
Victories fell like dominoes. The Austrians called him a demon. His men called him the Little Corporal. He was always at the front, his coat splattered with mud and smoke, shouting orders, urging his men on. But what drove him was not just courage, it was obsession. He saw war as a living thing, a game of will and timing. In battle, he said, a minute decides the outcome. And he made every minute his own. Each victory fed his hunger. Europe began to whisper his name. Newspapers turned him into a legend, the young general who had conquered Italy almost by thought alone. In Paris, politicians admired him, envied him, feared him. For the first time, Napoleon felt the taste of glory, and it was intoxicating.
Yet behind his triumphs, there was restlessness. He began to see France as too small for his ambition. The revolution had promised equality, but he wanted greatness. He had risen by its fire, but he did not wish to serve it forever. Power had become not a reward, but a need. Amid the victories, he met Josephine de Beauharnais, graceful, older, mysterious. She captivated him completely. In her, he found not peace, but fascination. He wrote her letters filled with longing, fury, and tenderness. "I wake up full of you," he wrote, "your image and the memory of last night's intoxicating pleasures." Love became another battlefield, one he could not command. Still, war was his true language. He spoke it fluently, brilliantly. His soldiers followed him as if he were destiny itself. He rewarded them with plunder, with honor, with belief. "A soldier," he told them, "fights long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon." And they did. By the end of the campaign, France controlled Italy. The young general returned home a hero, the embodiment of a new kind of power, born not from birthright, but from merit and will. The people cheered, but the politicians watched carefully. They saw the danger in his charm, the empire in his eyes. Napoleon smiled politely, bowed to them all, and waited. He knew fame was not enough. Victory was not enough. Something greater was calling. Something beyond France, beyond glory, beyond reason. As his carriage rolled through the cheering crowds, he leaned back and whispered to himself, "I have found the path. Now, I must walk it to the end." The boy from Corsica was gone. The general had risen. And soon, the world would kneel before him. Chapter 5. The Egyptian Mirage. 1798. The air in Paris was heavy with politics and suspicion. Napoleon had returned from Italy a hero, adored by the people, feared by the politicians. They saw his ambition like a shadow creeping up the walls of power. To keep him far from France, they offered him a dream. Egypt, a land of sand and sun, mysterious, ancient,
eternal. A campaign that promised glory without threat. But to Napoleon, it was more than a military expedition. It was destiny. A chance to step beyond Europe, to measure himself against the pharaohs, to carve his name beside the pyramids. When his fleet sailed across the Mediterranean, he stood on the deck for hours, silent, staring into the horizon. "Europe is a molehill," he whispered once. "All great glory is in the east." In those words was his illusion, the mirage of immortality. They landed under blinding light. The soldiers marched through a world that felt biblical. Golden dunes, burning wind, and silence that swallowed every sound. At first, the campaign was triumphant. At the Battle of the Pyramids, he faced the Mamluks, fierce horsemen of the desert. His voice carried through the heat. "Soldiers! 40 centuries look down upon you." And in that moment, his men believed they were part of history itself. Victory came swiftly, but so did the curse of the sands. The heat, the hunger, the endless distance. Disease spread through the camps. The Nile shimmered with both beauty and decay. Napoleon walked among the wounded, his boots covered in dust, his eyes still burning with purpose. Yet something inside him began to shift. Egypt was not what he imagined. The glory he sought felt hollow beneath the weight of the desert. He found himself drawn not to battle, but to thought. He spoke with scholars, studied ruins, gazed at stars. For a time, the conqueror became a philosopher. Standing before the pyramids at dusk, he once murmured, "Man is small, yet his will can be infinite." But the mirage could not last. News arrived. The British had destroyed his fleet at Aboukir Bay. The sea that had carried him to his dream had now trapped him in sand. His soldiers were stranded, his campaign bleeding hope. Still, he refused to yield. "From the sublime to the ridiculous," he said calmly, "is but a step." He walked that step with unshaken pride. Josephine's letters from France reached him, filled with rumor, betrayal, distance. His heart cracked quietly. He began to see that even love, like conquest, could fade beneath time and sun. The empire of the heart, he realized, was harder to rule than any kingdom on earth. By 1799, the desert no longer called to him. He had come to conquer Egypt, but it was Egypt that conquered him, stripping him of illusion, of faith, of peace. He left the army behind and returned to France in secret, carrying with him no gold, no empire, only a clearer understanding of his own hunger. The sands of Egypt had shown him a truth he would never forget, that no matter how far a man travels, he can never escape himself. And somewhere, deep within that truth, the spark of his next ambition began to glow. For destiny was not done with Napoleon Bonaparte. Chapter 6. The Consul of France. 1799. Paris was restless again. The revolution had devoured its heroes and left only fatigue in its wake. The government, the Directory, stumbled between corruption and chaos. The people were hungry not just for bread, but for order. And into this weary land, a figure returned from the east, silent, mysterious, wrapped in rumor like a cloak. Napoleon Bonaparte had come home. He found France exhausted. The ideals of liberty had turned to ash, and the republic that was meant to save the people now suffocated them. Yet Napoleon saw opportunity where others saw ruin. He walked the streets of Paris like a man reading a map of destiny. Every whisper, every glance, a sign of the path ahead. In the salons and corridors of power, alliances began to form. Men who feared the mob more than tyranny turned to him. He was still young, but his name had already become legend. He listened more than he spoke, but when he did, his words carried the weight of certainty. "France," he said softly, "needs not another revolution, but salvation." The coup came swiftly. On November 9th, 1799, 18 Brumaire by the revolutionary calendar, soldiers marched through Paris. The chambers of government trembled with confusion and fear. Some cried treason, others relief. And as the smoke cleared, one name remained: Napoleon. He did not crown himself yet. Instead, he became first consul, a title both humble and imperial. It was genius, power hidden behind modesty. France would not be ruled, he said, but guided. He promised to end corruption, rebuild the economy, and restore pride. And for a time, he delivered. Roads were repaired, laws rewritten, schools founded. The people began to believe again, not in liberty or equality, but in him. Yet, beneath the calm surface, the old fire burned. Napoleon worked tirelessly, sleeping little, speaking less. His mind was an engine, calculating, planning, never resting. To govern, he once said, is to choose, and he always chose himself. He returned to the battlefield soon after. In Italy once more, he faced the Austrians. Against all odds, he triumphed, and with that victory, France's faith in him became unshakable. When he rode back into Paris, the cheers followed like thunder. To the people, he was no longer a man. He was destiny made flesh. At home, however, his heart remained divided. Josephine, charming, faithless, irresistible, stood beside him as the nation watched. He loved her, but mistrusted her just as deeply. In his letters, the words swung between tenderness and fury. Power had made him greater, but also lonelier. He was no longer the boy from Corsica or the dreamer of the desert. He was something else now, something harder to define. In the quiet of the night, he would walk through the Tuileries Palace, the seat of kings he had once despised, and pause before the mirrors.
He saw not reflection, but transformation. France's destiny seemed to look back at him. They need me, he thought, and so I must rise. He began drafting the constitution of the consulate. It gave the illusion of democracy, but the reality of control. Every decision, every decree passed through his hands. The revolution had promised freedom. Napoleon offered stability. And the people chose stability. They always do. By 1802, he was appointed consul for life. The applause was deafening. The republic that began in rebellion had quietly given birth to monarchy again. Only this time, the crown was invisible. That night, Paris glowed with celebration. Fireworks burst above the Seine, and crowds sang his name. But in a quiet room, away from the light, Napoleon sat at his desk, staring at a map of Europe. His fingers traced the borders, like a man tracing the outline of a dream. He had conquered France without blood. Now, his eyes turned outward once more. The Consul of France was already thinking like an emperor. Chapter 7. The Emperor of Europe. 1804. The world was watching. France, the nation that had beheaded its king, now gathered beneath the vaulted ceilings of Notre Dame to witness a coronation. But this time, there was no Bourbon, no divine right. There was only one man, short in stature, colossal in will. Napoleon Bonaparte. As the music swelled and the light poured through stained glass, the Pope himself stood waiting with the crown. Tradition demanded that he place it on Napoleon's head. But Napoleon turned, took the crown in his own hands, and placed it upon himself. The gesture said what words never could. His power came from no one but him. The crowd erupted, some in awe, others in fear. France had not just found an emperor. Europe had found its storm. He became Emperor of the French, not King of France, a small difference, yet profound. His empire, he said, would not rest on bloodlines, but on merit, courage, and destiny. A throne, he once murmured, is only a bench covered in velvet, unless one knows how to sit upon it. He reimagined France. The Napoleonic Code, his true monument, gave order to chaos, reason to law. He built roads, libraries, banks. He united a fractured nation under one vision, glory. And through that vision, France became a continent's heartbeat again. But an emperor's crown is made not just of gold, but of conquest. Across Europe, he saw only maps waiting to be redrawn. Italy, Prussia, Austria, all fell beneath the rhythm of his march. His armies, the Grande Armée, moved like a tide, unstoppable, elegant, devastating. At Austerlitz, he achieved his masterpiece, defeating 2 empires in a single day. Soldiers, he told them afterward, remember this day, for it will be worthy of you. Europe trembled. Thrones fell. Monarchs whispered his name like a curse. Yet, among his soldiers, he was adored. The little corporal who remembered their names, who shared their hardships, who rode through smoke with the same fearless eyes, that once stared across the Egyptian sands. But power feeds on itself. The more he conquered, the more he hungered. Each victory made the next inevitable. Spain resisted. Britain endured. Russia watched. Napoleon's map of Europe glowed like fire. But the edges of that fire were beginning to darken. At home, he longed for an heir. Josephine could not give him one. The decision that followed broke his heart quietly. Their love, born in the chaos of revolution, ended beneath the weight of empire. He divorced her, with sorrow, not anger, and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria. It was a union of politics, not passion. A bridge to legitimacy, to dynasty, to eternity. Or so he hoped. His son was born soon after. Napoleon held the child in his arms and whispered, "You will be greater than I." Yet, somewhere deep inside, he knew greatness could not be inherited, only seized. In those years, France glittered with triumph. Artists painted him as a Roman god. Poets called him Destiny's chosen. Even his enemies in private could not deny his brilliance. But behind every empire lies a shadow, and Napoleon's was growing long. The wars had cost France dearly. Fields lay empty. Mothers wept for sons. The treasury drained like blood. Still, he pressed on, for to stop was to fall, and he could not bear the thought of falling. One evening, as the sun sank over Paris, he stood on a balcony of the Tuileries, looking toward the horizon. The bells of the city echoed faintly, distant yet warm. For a moment, the conqueror seemed still. Not emperor, not soldier, but man. He closed his eyes and whispered to no one. "I was born to command. But sometimes, I wish I had been born to rest." In that quiet confession lay the truth of his glory and the seed of his ruin. Chapter 8. The Russian Winter. 1812. The empire stood at its height, vast, glittering, invincible. From Lisbon to Warsaw, Europe bent beneath Napoleon's will. But triumph breeds its own blindness. The emperor who once measured every risk now listened more to pride than reason. Russia, distant and defiant, refused to bow. And so Napoleon decided to march, not for territory, not for gold, but for control of history itself. He gathered the greatest army the world had ever seen, more than 600,000 men. They came from every corner of Europe, French, Italians, Poles, Germans. They sang his name as they crossed the Niemen River, believing no power could stand against them. The horizon seemed endless. The emperor rode at the front, eyes fixed eastward. "We shall be in Moscow within 20 days, he said quietly. But the land had other plans. Russia was not an enemy of men. It was an enemy of time. Villages burned before the French arrived. Crops vanished. Wells were poisoned. Fields turned to ash. The Russians retreated endlessly, drawing the invaders deeper into silence and snow. Napoleon's soldiers, used to wine and victory, found only smoke and hunger. Yet still they marched, because he marched. At Borodino, the Russians finally turned to fight. It was a massacre without meaning. 70,000 dead in one day. The earth drank their blood until the fields turned red. When the smoke cleared, the French stood victorious, but hollow. Napoleon looked upon the battlefield, the heaps of bodies, and felt no joy. "One more such victory," he murmured, "and I am undone." Weeks later, he reached Moscow. The city was empty, its people gone, its treasures taken. And as his soldiers wandered through silent streets, fires broke out. Within hours, Moscow became an inferno, a sea of flame, devouring wood and stone. Napoleon stood on a balcony of the Kremlin, his face lit by the burning city. "So," he whispered, "this is how they greet their conqueror." He waited for peace. None came. Tsar Alexander refused to negotiate. The emperor lingered too long among the ashes. And then, the snow began to fall. The retreat was not a march. It was a slow death. Frost bit through uniforms. Horses collapsed. Men stumbled and vanished into white. The wind howled like a curse. Bread turned to stone in their hands. Muskets froze. The same soldiers who once crossed Europe like thunder now moved like ghosts. Napoleon rode among them, silent, his coat heavy with ice. He watched his army crumble, not from battle, but from the cold indifference of nature. "The Almighty," he said once, "has been too strong for me." His words carried no bitterness, only the weariness of a man who had seen his reflection in the mirror of fate. The crossing of the Berezina River was chaos. Bridges collapsed, cannons sank. Men screamed and vanished beneath black water. The air was filled with fire and snow and despair. Napoleon's marshals begged him to flee. He refused until the very end, then slipped away in silence, leaving the remnants of his grand army behind. When he returned to Paris, he was no longer the god of war, but a shadow wrapped in memory. The people cheered as he passed, though many did not recognize the hollow eyes of the man they once worshipped. He had set out to conquer Russia, and instead, it had conquered him. The campaign that began with drums ended with silence. Of 600,000 men, fewer than 100,000 returned. The rest lay buried beneath snow that would never melt. That winter became a legend, not just of defeat, but of human hubris. For even the greatest of men can be undone, not by enemies, but by the vast indifference of the world itself. And somewhere, deep within the frost of his memory,
Napoleon carried the whisper of that endless plain, a sound like the sigh of destiny, reminding him that every empire, no matter how mighty, must one day face the cold.
Chapter 9. The Fall of the Eagle. 1813. The drums of war beat again, but this time they echoed hollow through the streets of Paris. The Grand Army was gone, swallowed by snow and silence. Yet Napoleon, ever defiant, refused to believe the dream was dying. "My star has not set," he told his generals. "It burns still, only dimmed by clouds." But even as he spoke, Europe was rising against him. Prussia, Austria, Russia, Britain, once divided, now united by fear. They called him the enemy of peace, the tyrant of the continent. To Napoleon, they were merely obstacles, and obstacles were meant to be crushed. But his power was fading. France was weary. Its sons were gone, its fields barren. And for the first time, the emperor marched to battle with boys instead of men. At Leipzig, the Battle of Nations, he faced the full force of Europe. The sky was black with smoke and cannon fire. For 3 days, he fought with the desperation of a man fighting not for victory, but for the memory of who he once was. His marshals begged him to retreat. He hesitated, then whispered, "France will follow me into hell, but I must not lead her there." He ordered the withdrawal, too late. Bridges collapsed, soldiers drowned, and the eagle, his proud emblem, was torn from the banners. He returned to France diminished, but not broken. "I may lose battles," he said, "but I shall never lose faith." Yet, faith could not feed armies. The people began to turn away. Paris no longer burned with adoration, only with exhaustion. By 1814, the Allies crossed the French border. The war had come home. Napoleon fought like a lion cornered, darting from front to front, winning small victories that changed nothing. Each success was followed by a deeper loss. The emperor, who once commanded Europe, now struggled to hold his own soil. On April 6th, he abdicated. In a quiet room at Fontainebleau, surrounded by men who once worshipped him, he signed away his throne. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of finality. "I tried to raise France to the height of greatness," he said softly. "She has fallen with me." They sent him to Elba, a small island, a gilded cage. There, stripped of glory, but not of will, he walked the rocky shores and stared out across the Mediterranean. The sea shimmered, endless and mocking. Yet within him, something still stirred. That restless flame that had never known surrender. "I will return," he whispered to the wind. "My star will rise again." And he did. In March 1815, he escaped Elba with a few hundred men. As his ship approached France, soldiers sent to arrest him waited on the road. He stepped forward alone and called out, "If any of you would kill your emperor, here I am." No one fired. Instead, they knelt. The eagle had taken flight once more. Paris erupted with joy. The throne was his again, for 100 days. In that brief blaze of resurrection,
He tried to rebuild the impossible, but Europe would not forgive. The great powers gathered one last time, their armies moving like storm clouds toward Belgium. And there, at a small village named Waterloo, the final curtain began to fall. The battle was brutal, the rain unending. Napoleon fought with the fury of memory, not hope. At dusk, as cannon smoke drifted across the field, he saw the collapse of the Imperial Guard, the heart of his army, his pride. "The Guard dies," one officer shouted, "but does not surrender." Yet surrender was already written in the mud beneath their boots. Defeat came quietly, like dusk swallowing day. The eagle that had soared above Europe now fell, wings broken but unbowed. When all was lost, he said only, "The work of my life is destroyed." That night, he rode away under a gray sky, his uniform stained, his dreams dissolving into rain. For the first time, he was simply a man, small, against the vastness of the world he once ruled. The fall of Napoleon was not just the end of an empire. It was the end of belief in invincibility. The eagle had fallen, yes, but the legend had just begun to rise. Chapter 10: The Island and the Legend. 1815. The dream had ended. After Waterloo, Europe exhaled in relief and sorrow. The man who had once shaped nations was now a prisoner of history. When Napoleon surrendered to the British, he hoped for honor, perhaps exile in peace. But England feared him still, feared his voice, his vision, his legend. And so they sent him farther than any map could comfort him, to a lonely rock at the edge of the world, St. Helena, an island lost in the South Atlantic, windswept, grey, surrounded by endless sea. Here, the eagle was caged. The horizon mocked him, stretching wider than his empire ever had. Each morning he walked the cliffs, his coat pulled tight, his eyes scanning the waves for ships that never came. "I am alone," he said once, "with my memories and the ocean." His captors called it exile. To him, it was slow erasure. The rooms were damp, the food poor, the company dull. Yet even here, Napoleon remained Napoleon. He rose at dawn, dictated his memoirs, paced, argued, remembered. The man who had commanded millions now commanded words. He told his story as if to wrestle with time itself, shaping memory into immortality. He spoke of battles, of betrayal, of destiny. He painted himself not as conqueror, but as misunderstood visionary, a man born before his age. "I wanted to found a system based on merit, not birth," he said. "I wanted to lift men by their courage, not their names." Europe was not ready. His words carried both pride and sorrow, and something like truth. The island changed him. The emperor began to fade, and the man beneath began to speak. He laughed more with the servants, shared his bread, tended small gardens. he told stories to children who did not know his name. There were days when he would sit beneath the open sky, the sea wind in his hair, and whisper to himself, "I once ruled the world. Now I rule only my thoughts." And yet, even in exile, his presence filled the air. The British guards, meant to watch him, found themselves drawn to him. Some feared him still, others pitied him. They saw not a monster, but a man who had flown too close to the sun. Years passed slowly. His health declined. The island, with its damp air and isolation, became his final battlefield. He suffered in silence, writing letters to no one, dreaming of France, its rivers, its music, its people. "I see her in my sleep," he said once. "As a mother, I cannot return to." In May 1821, the light began to fade. The doctors called it stomach illness. Others said heartbreak. In his final hours, he murmured words that would echo forever. "France, army, Josephine." Then, like a wave retreating into the sea, Napoleon was gone. He was buried beneath the willows of St. Helena, far from the land he loved. The ocean kept his secret, but legends do not die easily. Years later, his body was brought home to Paris. As the coffin entered the city, crowds lined the streets, silent, weeping. The emperor had returned, not as ruler, but as memory. Beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, he rests still, wrapped in red velvet, surrounded by marble and history. Above him, the light falls through the dome like eternal dawn. And so, the boy from Corsica, the general of the revolution, the emperor of Europe, became something even greater, a story. Because Napoleon's true empire was not land, nor crown, nor army. It was imagination. He showed the world the terrifying beauty of human will, how far it can rise, and how completely it can fall. He remains a mirror for us all, our dreams, our pride, our longing to matter. Perhaps that is why, 2 centuries later, his shadow still moves quietly through the corridors of time. Not as tyrant, not as saint, but as man. And in that fragile, flawed humanity, we find the reason we remember. If you've journeyed with us through the rise and fall of Napoleon, through ambition, triumph, and tragedy, thank you. His story, like all great stories, reminds us how fragile greatness truly is, and how enduring the human spirit can be. If this tale touched you, if it made you pause, reflect, or simply feel, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us bring more stories like this to life. Stories of men and women who shaped the world, and of the quiet truths they left behind. Leave a comment. Tell us what part of Napoleon's journey spoke to you most. And until our next story, let history
whisper you to sleep.